Welcome, my lovely listeners. I'm your host, Sibusiwe Zulu, and this is the podcast Resilient Revival. In today's episode, we embark on a journey to explore the often overlooked world of abandoned buildings, which is sometimes referred to bad buildings or hijacked buildings. These buildings are more than just vacant structures. They hold the tales of human experiences, the untapped potential, and the complexities of urban life. In this podcast, we aim to delve deep into the captivating realm of these buildings, particularly shedding light on the challenges, opportunities, and the transformative possibilities they present. On this episode, we delve into the topic of living conditions in the abandoned buildings, focusing on the challenges faced by the people residing in the buildings. Joining us today is Nomzamo Zondo, who's the Director of Litigation at SERI, the Socio-economic Rights Institute. With her extensive expertise and insightful research on the subject, Nomzamo Zondo has written numerous articles shedding light on the living conditions, the struggles of individuals with abandoned buildings. We are honored to have her today to provide us with the valuable insights into this important issue. Welcome, ma'am. Before we even start delving into the specific challenges faced by the individuals living in the abandoned buildings, could you please share with our listeners a bit about your background?
So I am Nomzamo Zondo. I'm a lawyer and an attorney here at SERI. I've been working with SERI for the last 10 years. I'm now the executive director. In that 10 years, I've worked representing unlawful occupiers living in the inner city of Johannesburg, and have, as part of my work, been advocating with the local government, with national government, at times with provincial government, and also private property owners, so that there is a better management of unlawful occupation in the inner city of Joburg.
Okay, can you please tell us more about the company, the organization that you're working for? How is it sort of related to the people occupying the buildings?
So SERI was established in 2009. When we explain what our work is about, we always explain that our work is meant to answer three questions that are at the forefront of the lives of people living in South Africa. One of those questions is a question about securing a home, because we work with many people who live in buildings, in informal settlements without legal rights, people that are referred to in the law as unlawful occupiers, colloquially and we think wrongly as hijackers, invaders. We work with those communities, and in our work around securing a home, we've been fighting to ensure that people who do not have secure tenure get secure tenure, at times through representing them in litigation for their eviction, at times representing them where they are trying to access basic services, and then in rare cases where also they are fighting for the upgrading of informal settlements, specifically with the inner city communities. We've also worked with them in advocating with the local state around how the city of Johannesburg could better address the housing crisis in the inner city, engaging with the city of Johannesburg around how access to basic services could be beneficial not only to the unlawful occupiers but to the state as well.
That is so interesting. So based on your experience or your research, can you kindly help us understand some of the reasons behind the abandonment of the buildings and who actually occupy those buildings and why do they feel like that's like the space that's like the comfortable space, or that's where they should be living?
I feel bad because I feel like we should have had this conversation earlier on, but I mean, you're gonna edit, right? You're gonna edit as you feel. I think so. For instance, the word abandoned building is very, very difficult to work with, precisely because in Joburg there was a time of abandonment of buildings, and that's between the 90s and the early 2000s. But from the early 2000s onwards, there's at least, or maybe even from the late 90s onto the 2000s as we are in now, there's been an attempt where those buildings have been abandoned of people buying them and taking them over. And in effect, when we are not even, I don't think we can say as SERI we're active in buildings that are abandoned, because in all the buildings that we're active in, if you're talking about the abandonment from the owner, there is someone who is an owner of the deeds office and who's claiming that ownership today. Or two, I think if there's a case where the owner is inactive, there are people who live in that building who are trying to exercise, manage the building for their daily life. So just the term is a very, very difficult term to work with, because that abandonment is an abandonment that happened over 20 years ago. And after that, there's been a process of almost a takeover. Whenever I think of the inner city of Joburg and gentrification specifically, I always think about how it's actually been a process of people trying to amass wealth at the cost of other people. So these new owners, right, who most of the time would have bought the building at very, very low prices, are people who now just want to say, I've made this investment, and out of this investment, I want these plus so that I can make my millions. And so in effect, then the term abandoned is very difficult, because it was abandoned, and somehow someone else managed to wrestle it out of that abandonment. And I want to give you an example. So one of the buildings that we work in is a building called Remington Court. So Remington Court was owned by a company, Allard Pty. And that Allard Pty was active and was initially a commercial property in the 80s and in the early 90s. But from the early 90s, the manager, who was a director in the company, allowed people in the company to rent it for residential purposes. So even at a time when it was not lawful for people to live in the inner city, for black people to live in the inner city, he was renting it out to them for that purpose. But from the late 90s, the company disappears, this director disappears. And what then happens is that the building starts accumulating municipal rates and municipal services, and there's no one paying for that. So I think around 2012, the city of Johannesburg starts a process, I think even earlier than that, but they started a process to claim the municipal services. And when they claim them, so at least that building between late 90s, even up to 2010, is actually abandoned. And it's an abandonment. The city of Johannesburg doesn't go to the building and investigate who's living there, how are you living there. It simply says, this property owner owes me money, and they pursue them in the legal process. When they pursue them in the legal process, they end up liquidating the company. And in the liquidation, they then, of course, the only asset owned by the company is the building. And when the asset that's owned by the building is the building, then someone else purchases it. So from 2012 to probably now in 2022, I believe there's been 3 owners who've owned the building, because the first owner who bought it immediately in 2012, Nulane Investments, immediately brought an eviction in 2013. And that's when the abandonment stopped. And then there is, at that time, tension and a struggle between this new owner who's bought the building from a process that started by the government with the unlawful occupiers, some of whom, I think the woman who initially signed the opposing papers in the eviction had moved in, I think in 1992, and she'd rented her room from the director of the company that owned the building. So she comes in, she's now faced with a new person who to her is the hijacker, because he's the person who's jumping onto a moving train. She's been living there for over a decade. Here's someone new who comes in, who's bought for next to nothing. And again, if you look at these two different people, the new property owner says, I've made an investment. I want to be able to, of course, renovate the building, rent it out at the astronomical rentals that are demanded in the inner city, and make money. The 600, close to 600 people that live in the building are saying, we've been here for years. We've never known you. We've been living peacefully here. And in fact, whenever if you talk to people who live in these buildings in Zulu, and people explain, no, I own this room, and you're trying to explain to them that that's not how ownership works. When it's a piece of land, ownership is only registered through the deeds office, and that's how you own land. The fact that yes, you've been in peaceful occupation of this doesn't take away from the fact that you don't have the consent of the owner, which actually means that you are an unlawful occupier, and also means that you do not own this room. So that's really the process that we find ourselves engaging in, and almost ownership, and even the question of abandonment is invisible for people for as long as one, they're able to live peacefully, two, they're able to access basic services, and it's only at a time when someone comes and says, I want you out, or two, the municipality or someone else tries to disconnect their services, that they actually realize, oh, actually I don't own, or there's someone else who has rights that are stronger than mine, that they normally come to our office, and that's when we try and engage with them. And we've been involved in representing unlawful occupiers in the inner city of Joburg since 2010. The founders of SERI, who have now since moved on, were involved in the organization that they were part of previously. But in over 13 years, we've represented, 12 years, sorry, we've represented unlawful occupiers. And in almost all of these cases, most of the time, we're engaging with someone new who's come in and whose money has enabled them to buy stronger rights, and people have been there for a much longer time. Now this, I think in any other context, and possibly in other countries, it wouldn't have been an issue of justice that someone who has money can buy a building. But in South Africa, where land dispossession was the main tool of the previous government, and a government that discriminated against Black people, you have to find a way to protect the rights of Black people who live now in those buildings insecurely, not because of choice, but because the system and history has designed it in that way. That if you look at the Joburg inner city, it's for people to live here lawfully, even today, they must be in a position to pay astronomical rents, right? Or have been fortunate to have had family who gave them, who owned, which chances are those people are not Black. If you look at our country's unemployment levels, if you look at the levels of inequality in this country, again, it tells you that they're unlikely to be Black. So in the inner city of Joburg, Black people's choices in terms of being able to live here is really a choice of you either live unlawfully or you live lawfully in overcrowded conditions. Because the only way you get to afford rental in the inner city is if you're sharing it with 3 other households, with 4 other households, and then you can afford it. And that's part of the reason why we've been advocating for the city to have a policy, one, that addresses unlawful occupation in a way that doesn't just say, okay, when someone takes you to court, we'll get involved, but to do it in a way that first, on the first hand, even to start with, knows who is living in the inner city, who's living in the city unlawfully, who are the owners, and engage in a way that can even keep people where they are. Almost the same as a process where they upgrade people's rights in what you would say abandoned buildings, or what are known as bed buildings, through a process of one, as I said, mapping, understanding who it is, engaging with the different stakeholders, and then 3, providing resources for the renovation of these buildings. And this process should also include the provision of basic services, ensuring that there is water, that there is sanitation, that there is electricity. And then in that way, kind of address this. Unfortunately, I don't feel like we've managed to convince the city around the utility and the importance of doing that. Instead, it almost seems like that's the trend is unlawful occupiers are acting unlawfully and therefore should not be engaged. The only time they are engaged is if they are represented by organizations like SERI or the Center for Applied Legal Studies or the Legal Resources Center or Fasken Matinu, but they're never engaged when they knock on the doors of the city. In fact, even buildings who are even partially abandoned. Another interesting case study, a building known as Facades Mansions, which is opposite the F&B complex here in the inner city of Johannesburg. Yeah. And that building was a building that a part of it had been bought by the provincial government as RDP subsidies for certain households. And then parts of it were privately owned. The private owners abandoned their units, leaving the RDP or subsidized housing beneficiaries buckling under the pressure of taking care of that building. And eventually, even though after probably over 10 years of them engaging the city, where they have a file that's knee high, where they kept saying, we have this problem and that problem and this problem and that problem, they're not getting any help from the city of Johannesburg, then someone opportunistically then says to one of the owners that abandoned it previously, do you know that you own shares and you own units in this building, and you know the building is run down, do you know that I can convert it into money for you? And then there's a process where the sectional title, because the scheme is the units are held in a sectional title scheme. The sectional title is then someone approaches a court to say you must declare the sectional title scheme as destroyed and give me powers to administer the sectional title scheme. And in that process, there's an eviction of people who live there. The building even now is standing empty because, again, it's a scheme to extract as much wealth out of it as possible. But in that process, the subsidized beneficiaries have lost out. They've lost their subsidy, they've lost their units. But that's because the city has not in its mind committed to engaging on addressing unlawful occupation. Even as you put it, addressing abandonment, because there was lawful occupation. The people there were lawful occupiers, but because there was partial abandonment of the building, then they lost their homes. And I think one of the things that's important for us is that because we feel that the crossover post April 1994 should have confirmed that Black people are welcome everywhere in South Africa. And that includes the inner city of Johannesburg. And if it includes the inner city of Johannesburg, they should be able to live there regardless of their earnings. It can't be, as we see now, that the understanding is, look, the inner city is for the middle class and those who can pay. The inner city should be, the inner city should be welcoming to everyone, and we accept, of course, that there will be property developers who are gonna profiteer firstly, but also renovate and run buildings in the inner city of Johannesburg. But then the state must play its role, and the state playing its role means that it must develop its own buildings, but to almost an opportunity that they are fast losing out on would have been for them to take over these abandoned or unlawfully occupied buildings as a process where they actually ensure that poor people can have a place in the inner city of Johannesburg. And that really, that's an opportunity that they are missing out on. I don't feel like it's an opportunity that they grasp. Almost from every mayor of Johannesburg, going back even before Mayor Pakstow, the vision for the inner city is to simply hand it over to private hands. There isn't really there isn't a clear commitment or even a truthful commitment to an inner city that has state-managed, state-developed accommodation. In an environment where we know that ownership of land, ownership of buildings is something that is very, very far from the ordinary South African. Our economy, I think pre-COVID, I would have said the same thing to you, but post-COVID, we know that it's even more difficult without state assistance for ordinary South Africans to have a home in the inner city of Joburg.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this episode once again. We will meet on the next episode. Bye.